Jack was an imposing figure, a great dog with a powerful, muscular body and a coat the color of darkened steel. His presence alone could make people step back, but behind his massive frame and deep-set eyes was a creature of quiet loyalty. Jack was no ordinary pet. He was a soldier, a trained war dog who had once served alongside men in the brutal chaos of battle. He had fought in places where the air was thick with the acrid scent of gunpowder, where every day was a fight for survival. He had known the weight of duty, the meaning of loss. And now, he had a new purpose, one he had chosen himself. Zoe Williams had been 12 years old when Jack entered her life, and from the moment she met him, she knew they belonged together. With her dark brown skin glowing in the afternoon light and her eyes full of quiet determination, she reached out to touch him. The war dog, who had spent his life obeying commands, stood still, watching her carefully. When her small fingers ran over his thick fur, something inside him settled. He had been trained to follow orders, but now, instinct told him to protect this child. Jack had not always been a household guardian. He had once belonged to a man, a soldier who had given everything for his country. Sergeant Marcus Williams had been his handler, his partner, the one person Jack had trusted above all others. Together, they had faced the kind of danger most people only saw in nightmares. But war had taken Marcus, leaving behind only a folded flag and a series of unspoken promises. Naomi Williams had never wanted a dog. She had grown up in a world where large dogs were not seen as companions, but as threats. In her childhood, they had been used against boys who had run too far, too fast, down the wrong streets. They had been weapons of control, not symbols of comfort. But Jack was different. He was the last piece of Marcus that she had left, a living reminder of the man she had loved and lost. More than that, he was Zoe's protector. Their family had already faced too much loss. Naomi had spent years building a life for herself and her daughter after Marcus's death. She had worked her way up in the banking industry, becoming a senior accountant, ensuring Zoe had everything she needed. They had moved into a peaceful, predominantly white suburban neighborhood, a place that was supposed to be safe. But safety was an illusion. People in town did not say much, but their stares said enough. The quiet, polite smiles never reached their eyes. The subtle pauses before answering Naomi's questions, the cautious glances at Jack as he walked beside Zoe. It was clear they were not welcome. "That dog is dangerous," a neighbor had muttered once, watching Jack from across the street. "You should get rid of him before something happens." Naomi had met the woman's gaze without blinking. "Something like what?" she asked, her voice smooth but firm. The woman had hesitated, then forced a tight smile. "You just never know with those big breeds." Zoe had heard the conversation, her small hands tightening in Jack's fur. She understood what the woman really meant. Jack wasn't the problem. They were. Some people in town made their feelings clearer. "That thing yours?" an older man had asked Zoe one day outside the grocery store. His words were casual, but the way his eyes lingered on her made her skin crawl. Zoe had straightened her back. "He's my best friend." The man had snorted, shaking his head. "Dogs like that don't belong with girls like you." She had wanted to say something more, but Jack had already stepped forward, his massive frame shifting between them, his deep eyes locked onto the man in silent warning. The man took a step back. He understood the message. Zoe wasn't naive. She knew the world saw her differently. She had felt it in school when teachers ignored her raised hand for too long. She had seen it in stores when clerks followed her movements with too much interest. She had heard it in the way people spoke to her, as if she was something they did not fully trust. But Jack didn't care about any of that. When she walked down the street, he walked beside her, his powerful body a shield against the world. When she sat on the porch reading, he curled up next to her, his presence a silent promise. When she lay awake at night, missing her father, Jack was there, his steady breathing keeping her grounded. Naomi noticed it too. At first, she had been hesitant. Jack was a trained war dog. What if he lost control? What if the trauma of war had left him unpredictable? But as time passed, she saw how he watched over Zoe, how he never left her side. She saw the way Zoe whispered secrets into his ear, the way Jack responded to her voice like it was the only one that mattered. Naomi still missed Marcus every day. His presence lingered in the house, in the old photos, in the folded flag on the mantel, in the way Zoe sometimes looked at Jack like she was searching for something of her father in him. But Jack was here, and as long as he was, they would be safe. Or at least, that was what she wanted to believe. But danger had a way of finding them, no matter how far they tried to outrun it. Naomi Williams had spent years working for the life she had built, sacrificing sleep, comfort, and time to ensure her daughter had opportunities that were never handed to her. She had climbed the corporate ladder with sheer determination, fighting for every promotion, proving herself twice over in a field where women like her were rarely seen in positions of power. As a senior accountant at one of the largest banks in the city, she was respected, intelligent, and unshakable. She was supposed to feel secure. She had earned the right to feel safe. But safety was a fragile thing, especially in a world that resented her success. She had noticed it before. The stares when she drove through the neighborhood in her sleek black sedan, the polite but distant nods from neighbors who never truly welcomed her. She had ignored it, choosing to believe that their discomfort would fade with time. But now, as she sat at her desk, staring at an email with no sender, a heavy weight settled in her chest. The message was short. You don't belong here. Leave before it's too late. Her fingers trembled slightly as she closed the laptop. It wasn't the first time. Over the past few months, there had been other messages. Anonymous notes left on her car windshield, whispered threats disguised as casual remarks. You must feel so lucky to have landed a job like that. It's nice to see people like you doing well while it lasts. Some places just aren't meant to change. She had dismissed them as empty words, the product of bitter men clinging to a world they refused to share. But now, something was different. The messages had stopped being passive. Now, they were a promise. The men who had been watching her called themselves the Patriots, an ironic name for a group that thrived on hatred and fear. They were not just an online forum of angry voices. They were real men with real plans, and Naomi had become their latest target. They had been observing her for months, tracking her routines, monitoring her movements. They knew where she worked, what time she came home, which days she picked up Zoe from school. They had watched her unlock the front door of her house, a house they believed had been stolen from them simply because it now belonged to a black family. They did not believe she had earned her position at the bank. In their eyes, she had taken something that should have belonged to a man like them, someone deserving. And she had brought her daughter into their community, into their schools, where she was poisoning the next generation. Their goal was simple. They needed to send a message. But warnings were not enough anymore. They needed something stronger, something that would break her completely. And that something was Zoe. Naomi locked her office door before dialing Zoe's number. The phone rang twice before her daughter's bright voice answered. Hey, Mom. The warmth in her voice was like a balm, easing some of the tension in Naomi's chest. Hey, baby, where are you? Still at school, Zoe replied. I was going to walk home with Sasha, but I can wait for you if you want to pick me up. Naomi exhaled, pressing a hand against her forehead. There was a part of her that wanted to tell Zoe to stay inside, to wait in the school office until she arrived. But she didn't want to scare her. Actually, that sounds great, she said instead, keeping her voice light. Stay there. I'll come get you soon, okay? Zoe hesitated, sensing something in her mother's tone. Are you okay? Naomi forced a small laugh. Just tired, sweetheart. Work has been long today. There was a pause before Zoe answered. Okay. Love you. Love you too, baby. Naomi hung up and leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. She needed to be smart. The police had already been dismissive before. When she reported the threats, they had listened with detached indifference, offering vague reassurances but no real action. Do you have any proof? Maybe it's just some kids messing around. Have you considered moving? It might be safer elsewhere. She knew that if she went to them now, they would do nothing. She had to protect Zoe herself. The men sat in a dimly lit garage. A map of the town spread across a worn wooden table. One of them traced a gloved finger along the route Naomi took every day, tapping his finger on the school's location. She's picking up the kid today, he said, his voice calm, almost businesslike. The others nodded. We do it fast, another man added. No mistakes this time. The first attempt had failed. They had underestimated Zoe's instincts, had not accounted for her quick thinking. The van had been useless, and the dog, that damn dog, had been an unexpected problem. But this time, there would be no mistakes. This time, they were going after Naomi first. They would be waiting inside the house when she returned. They would make her send the message herself. And Zoe would walk right into their trap. Jack had noticed them before Naomi did. The war dog had sensed something long before Naomi had even acknowledged the danger. He had smelled the unfamiliar scent lingering near the house, had noticed the way some cars passed by too slowly. He had been trained to recognize patterns, and something was wrong. Tonight, he sat near the back door, his ears alert, his body still as he listened. The front of the house was silent. But Jack knew silence was not always a sign of safety. Then he heard it, a sound too soft for most ears to detect. The subtle click of a lock being picked. Jack's muscles tensed. His breathing slowed. He did not move, did not make a sound. But he was ready, because someone was already inside. And Jack never failed his mission. Zoe Williams was careful. Her mother had taught her that the world wasn't the same for girls like her. She had learned from an early age that she couldn't afford to be reckless, couldn't afford to trust too easily, couldn't assume she was safe just because she had done nothing wrong. She followed the rules her mother had drilled into her. Always be aware of your surroundings. Never go anywhere with strangers. Trust your instincts, and most importantly, use the security password if something feels wrong. That last rule had already saved her once. But tonight she was alone. She sat outside the school, waiting for her mother to arrive, her backpack resting beside her on the stone bench. The late afternoon sun had begun to set, casting a golden glow over the emptying parking lot. Most of the students had already gone home, leaving only a handful of kids waiting for their rides. Zoe checked her phone, scrolling absent-mindedly through her messages. Then she saw it, a text from her mother. "Come home now. I need you." Zoe frowned slightly. The words were simple, but something about them didn't feel right. Her mother never texted like that. She was always specific. She would have said, "Hey, sweetheart, I'm running late. Can you walk home today? Let me know when you get there. Love you." This message was too short, too blunt. She hesitated for only a second before typing back. "What's the password?" She waited, her heart beating a little faster. 3 dots appeared on the screen, as if someone was typing. Then they disappeared. Zoe's breath caught in her throat. Her mother always responded with the password immediately. She never hesitated. Something was wrong. Her fingers tightened around the phone as she quickly pressed the call button, holding it up to her ear. The call didn't even ring. It went straight to voicemail. She tried again. The same thing happened. A chill ran down her spine. She turned her head, scanning the area around her. The school grounds were mostly empty now. A few kids were still talking near the bike racks, but otherwise the place was quiet. The teachers who had been standing by the front entrance earlier had already gone inside. She glanced toward the street. That was when she saw the van. It was parked across the road, its engine still running, the darkened windows making it impossible to see inside. At first, she tried to convince herself that it was just a coincidence. Just a delivery van or someone waiting for a friend. Then the door slid open. 2 men stepped out. They were tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in dark clothing, and they were looking right at her. Zoe felt her entire body tense. She knew. She knew in the same way she had known the first time. The same cold, twisting feeling in her stomach, the same instinct screaming at her to run. She gripped her phone, her fingers shaking as she tried to call 911. Before she could press the button, they moved. The first man lunged forward, his heavy boots pounding against the pavement as he closed the distance between them in seconds. Zoe barely had time to react before a rough hand clamped over her mouth. Her phone slipped from her fingers, hitting the pavement with a dull crack. She kicked, twisted, tried to scream, but the second man grabbed her arms, yanking them behind her back. "Keep her quiet," one of them muttered. Zoe thrashed with everything she had, but they were too strong. She was lifted off her feet as if she weighed nothing, her legs flailing in the air. The van door was still open. They were dragging her toward it. She knew that if they got her inside, she was never coming back. With every ounce of strength in her body, she threw her head back, slamming it against the first man's chin. He cursed, momentarily loosening his grip. Zoe took the chance to kick her heel into the other man's shin as hard as she could. "God damn it, hold her!" She twisted, almost breaking free. A fist slammed into her ribs. Pain exploded through her chest, stealing the breath from her lungs. The shock of it left her momentarily stunned, her body going limp just long enough for them to shove her inside the van. The door slid shut. The engine roared to life. Zoe Williams was gone. Naomi was already speeding down the road when her phone rang again. She answered immediately, her voice sharp. "Zoe." But it wasn't Zoe. It was the school secretary. "Mrs. Williams," the woman said, her voice tight with concern. "I just wanted to confirm. Did you ask Zoe to walk home?" Naomi's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "No," she said immediately. "She's waiting for me." "Why?" There was a pause. Then the woman said, "She got a message from your number telling her to leave. She asked for the password, but she didn't get a response." Naomi felt her pulse thunder in her ears. "Where is she now?" she asked, her voice deadly calm. There was silence. Then the woman whispered, "She's not here." Naomi's foot slammed against the gas pedal. She barely noticed the cars honking around her, barely registered the red lights she blew through. The only thing in her mind was her daughter. Zoe was missing, and this time, Naomi knew exactly who had taken her. Zoe struggled against the ropes, binding her wrists, her breath coming in short, painful gasps. The van smelled of sweat and cigarettes, the air thick and suffocating. The men in the front were talking like she wasn't even there, their voices calm, detached. "She fought harder than last time," one of them muttered, rubbing his jaw. "She won't fight for long," the driver said flatly. Zoe swallowed hard, trying to slow her breathing. She forced herself to listen, to memorize their voices, to remember anything that could help her later. "Make sure we take a different route this time," the first man said. "That damn dog ruined everything before. We're not making that mistake again." Jack! Her heart clenched. Jack had saved her last time. But Jack wasn't here now. She had no one to rely on but herself. She twisted her wrists, ignoring the burning pain as the rope scraped against her skin. The knot was tight, but not impossible. Her fingers brushed against something cold. Metal. A latch. She turned her head slightly, her heart pounding faster. The van's back doors. They were locked, but she could feel the latch shifting slightly when the van hit bumps in the road. If she could just reach it, she took a slow, deep breath. She had one chance. She wasn't going to waste it. The first thing Naomi Williams noticed when she stepped into her house was the unnatural silence. The air inside felt thick, suffocating. Something was wrong. She had spent years in this home, memorizing every sound, every creak in the floorboards, every hum of the appliances. But now everything was still, too still. Her grip tightened on her purse strap as she slowly closed the front door behind her. The soft click of the latch locking into place sent a shiver down her spine. Then she felt it, the presence of someone else. Before she could turn, before she could react, a strong hand clamped over her mouth. A sharp, cold object pressed against her side, a gun. "Don't scream," a low voice murmured against her ear. "You make a sound, and you die right here." Naomi's entire body went rigid, her heart hammering violently in her chest. Her first instinct was to fight, to struggle, but she forced herself to stay still. She had no idea how many of them there were. She needed to think. The man behind her tightened his grip, forcing her forward. "Move," he ordered. She obeyed, her feet moving stiffly across the hardwood floor. The living room came into view, and with it, 3 more men standing near the couch, all dressed in dark clothing. Their expressions were cold, emotionless, as if this were nothing more than a routine task. One of them, tall, with a shaved head and cruel, calculating eyes, gestured toward the couch. "Sit." Naomi's breath was coming too fast, but she forced herself to stay composed. She moved toward the couch slowly, lowering herself onto the cushion. The man who had grabbed her finally released his grip, but the gun remained, now held in plain sight, pointed directly at her chest. "Good girl," one of them sneered. Naomi lifted her chin, glaring at him. "What do you want?" The bald man took a slow step forward. You already know what we want." His voice was smooth, almost casual, but Naomi could hear the venom beneath it. "You ignored the warnings," he continued. "You stayed when you should have left. You think because you have a nice job, a nice house, that you belong here. But you don't." Naomi clenched her fists, nails digging into her palms. "You broke into my home," she said, her voice steady despite the fury burning inside her. "You put your hands on me. And for what? Because I have a job you think belongs to you?" The man chuckled. "It's not just a job," he said. "It's everything. This neighborhood, this school, this town. It's not for people like you." Naomi didn't flinch. She had heard it before, in different ways, in different tones, but the message was always the same. "Then why don't you just kill me now?" she asked coldly. The man's smirk widened. "Because that wouldn't send the right message." He nodded toward one of the others. "Give her the phone." Naomi's stomach turned to ice as one of the men pulled her phone from his pocket and tossed it onto the couch beside her. "Text your daughter," the bald man said. "Tell her to come home." Naomi's blood ran cold. Zoe. Her mind raced. They wanted to lure Zoe into this trap. She couldn't let that happen. She picked up the phone, her hands shaking slightly. The men watched her closely, their eyes sharp, waiting for her to do as they said. She typed the message slowly. "Come home now. I need you." Her finger hovered over the send button. Then at the last second, she did the only thing she could think of. She added, "What's the password?" She pressed send. One of the men frowned. "What's that?" Naomi kept her face blank. "It's something we do. She always asks for the password before coming home. If I don't send it, she won't believe it's me." The bald man studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Fine." Naomi clenched her jaw, barely containing her relief. Zoe would know something was wrong. The men relaxed slightly, convinced that everything was going according to plan. But what they hadn't realized was that someone else had been watching. Someone who had never let his guard down. Jack had been in the house the entire time. He had heard them before Naomi had even stepped inside. He had smelled them, the unfamiliar scent of sweat, gunpowder, and something sharp like adrenaline. He had stayed hidden, silent, unmoving. He had been trained for patience, for restraint. Now, from the shadows of the hallway, he watched. His deep brown eyes tracked the men's movements, his powerful body coiled and ready. Jack had seen Naomi's hand shake. He had seen the gun pressed against her ribs. He had understood everything. These men were not here to rob. They were here for something worse. Jack had been in war zones. He had fought beside soldiers, had smelled the thick scent of blood in the air, had heard the final breaths of dying men. He knew predators when he saw them, and he knew how to hunt. He stayed low, creeping through the hallway without a sound, his body moving like a shadow. He waited, his muscles twitching with anticipation. He would strike, but not yet. He needed the right moment. Naomi's phone vibrated against her palm. The men didn't notice. She glanced down quickly. It was Zoe. She had called Jack's number. It was a signal, a message they had trained Jack to recognize. The moment her daughter had pressed that button, the vibration sent a command to the war dog's collar. Jack's ears flicked. He had been given the order to attack. Naomi kept her face still, her body calm. Then she whispered, barely loud enough for anyone to hear. "Jack." The men barely had time to react. A massive shadow lunged from the hallway. Jack moved with terrifying speed, his powerful body slamming into the closest man before he could even lift his gun. His jaws clamped down on flesh, a sickening crunch filling the room as the man screamed. The others scrambled, cursing, reaching for weapons. Naomi moved before she could think. She grabbed the lamp from the side table, swinging it with every ounce of strength she had. It crashed against the skull of the nearest man, sending him sprawling onto the floor. Jack turned, his deep growl vibrating through the walls. The remaining man hesitated, his gun trembling in his grip. Naomi's voice was ice. "Get out of my house." The man swallowed, his knuckles white around the weapon. Jack took a slow step forward, his muscles coiled, his teeth bared. The man broke. He turned and ran. Naomi stood there, her chest heaving, the sound of her heartbeat deafening in her ears. Jack released his grip on the man beneath him, his deep eyes still burning with fury. Naomi reached for her phone with shaking hands and dialed. Zoe, she whispered the moment her daughter answered. Don't come home yet, baby. But don't worry, I'm safe. Jack stood beside her, his body still tense, still ready. This fight was over. But Naomi knew another one was coming. The men sat in a dimly lit garage, the air thick with the scent of gasoline, sweat, and stale cigarettes. A single light bulb swayed from the ceiling, casting long shadows across the cracked concrete floor. The group of four, now down to 3 after the failed attempt at Naomi's house, gathered around a wooden table, their expressions hard, their voices low. They had been planning this for months, watching, waiting, calculating every step to ensure that when they finally made their move, there would be no mistakes. Naomi Williams had been given warnings, subtle at first. Anonymous notes left on her windshield, whispers at the grocery store, eyes that followed her as she walked through a neighborhood where she was never meant to belong. She had ignored them, held her head high as if she had a right to stay. But they knew how to deal with people like her. At first, they had wanted to frighten her, to make her so uncomfortable that she would pack her bags and leave on her own. But she hadn't. She had stayed, working her high-paying job, raising her little girl in their town, living in a house that should have belonged to one of them. She had refused to understand her place. And for that, she had to be taught a lesson. The Patriots, as they called themselves, prided themselves on precision. They weren't just a group of angry men ranting online about the world changing around them. They were action. They were correction. And they had thought that taking Zoe Williams would be their final, flawless move. But now, as they sat around the table, licking their wounds from the night before, they realized something had gone wrong. She fought harder than expected, one of them muttered, rubbing his bruised ribs. The last encounter had left him sore, but it was the dog that had done the real damage. The beast had torn through them like they were nothing, faster, stronger, and more vicious than they had anticipated. It's just a dog, another said dismissively, leaning back in his chair. Big or not, it's still an animal. Animals die. The bald man sitting at the head of the table, the one who had led every move so far, glanced at him with an unreadable expression. Don't underestimate that thing. We should have killed it first. There was a heavy silence. They all knew what had happened. They had gone into that house believing that Naomi Williams was a victim, a woman who would break the moment a gun was pointed at her. They had expected her to cower, to beg, to give them what they wanted without a fight. Instead, she had stood her ground. And then there was the dog. That damn dog. It hadn't barked. It hadn't warned them. It had waited. It had watched. It had attacked with precision, with intent. Not like a pet defending its home, but like a soldier executing a mission. That thing was trained, one of them muttered, finally voicing what they had all been thinking. Not like some house pet, like a military dog. The bald man exhaled slowly, rolling a cigarette between his fingers. He had been leading their group for years, guiding them in their corrections, but this was the first time he had encountered something like this. A family that fought back. His jaw tightened. We finished what we started, he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of a decision that none of them could question. Naomi Williams thinks she won last night. She thinks that because we left, because the dog scared us off, that it's over. He leaned forward, placing both hands on the table. But we don't walk away from unfinished business. The others nodded, their confidence returning. The plan had failed, but the mission had not. They just had to adjust. The house was no longer the target. The dog was. Naomi sat at the kitchen table, staring at her hands. They were still shaking, just slightly, the tremor so small that no one else would notice. But she felt it. The adrenaline hadn't fully left her body, even hours later. Jack sat at her feet, his massive body still tense, his ears twitching at every sound. He hadn't relaxed either. He had won the battle, but he knew it wasn't over. Across from her, Zoe sat curled up in a chair, a blanket wrapped around her small frame. Her daughter was trying to be brave, but Naomi could see the way her fingers clutched the fabric, how her body was too still. She was afraid, and Naomi was furious. This was their home. She had spent her entire life proving that she belonged, that she had earned every single thing she had. And yet, none of it had mattered. These men still believed they could walk into her house, hold a gun to her head, take her child from her, and she was supposed to accept it? No. She wouldn't run. She wouldn't leave. She had fought too hard to be here. Jack's head lifted suddenly, his body going rigid. Naomi froze. Her heart pounded as she followed his gaze toward the window. The blinds were closed, but Jack's senses were sharper than hers. He could hear things she couldn't, smell things before they arrived. Mom? Zoe's voice was small, uncertain. Naomi held up a hand for silence. Jack stood up. His deep brown eyes were locked on the front door now, his body completely still. Then, ever so faintly, Naomi heard it. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Someone was outside. She reached for her phone, her fingers wrapping around it, ready to call the police. But she stopped herself. Last time, when she had reported the threats, the police had barely listened. Do you have any proof? Maybe it's just kids messing around. Have you considered moving? It might be safer elsewhere. She knew how that conversation would go. Jack would handle this. The footsteps stopped. Then, a moment later, there was a soft tap against the window. A warning. A message. Jack's lip curled back, revealing sharp, gleaming teeth. A low growl rumbled from his throat, so deep it vibrated through the floor. His muscles coiled, every fiber of his being preparing for battle. The men outside believed they were in control. They thought they could break this family. But they had made a mistake. They had underestimated who they were fighting. Naomi pressed a hand against Zoe's shoulder, keeping her daughter still. Jack lowered himself slightly, his growl deepening. The war dog was ready, and if these men came through that door, they wouldn't be walking back out. The night was thick with tension, the kind that pressed against the walls of the Williams home like a suffocating force. Naomi sat at the kitchen table, her fingers gripping the edge so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Across from her, Zoe sat curled up in her chair, her small frame wrapped in a blanket, her wide, frightened eyes darting to every shadow in the room. Jack lay near the front door, his massive body still as stone, his ears twitching at the slightest sound. He had not moved from his position for hours, his deep brown eyes locked onto the entrance as if daring someone to try and come through. The message the men had left was clear. They were not finished. The soft tap on the window had been a warning, a promise that they would return. Naomi had barely slept, her body too tense, too aware that danger was just beyond the door. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw them, 4 men dressed in black, their hands gripping her arms, their voices dripping with hatred. She had fought them off before. She had survived, but she knew they would not make the same mistakes twice. Jack knew it too. He had sensed them before anyone else had stayed silent in the shadows while they took control of the house. He had waited for the right moment to strike, to rip them apart when they least expected it. That was how he had been trained, not to react instantly, but to calculate, to watch, to wait, to destroy when the time was right. And now, they were coming back. Naomi's phone buzzed on the table, making her jump. She snatched it up, her hands trembling as she read the message on the screen. "We have your daughter. Come outside." Her stomach dropped. Her breath came in shallow, rapid gasps as her heart pounded violently against her ribs. She shot to her feet, nearly knocking over her chair. "Mom?" Zoe whispered, but Naomi barely heard her. Her fingers fumbled as she unlocked her phone and pressed call. The line rang once, twice, then went straight to voicemail. They weren't answering. They had Zoe. A surge of pure, raw fear crashed over her, followed by something else, rage. Jack's head snapped up, his ears fully erect now, his deep brown eyes focused on her as if he understood everything. Naomi turned to her daughter and knelt in front of her, gripping her shoulders tightly. "Zoe, I need you to stay here. No matter what happens, do not come outside." Zoe's face twisted with confusion and fear. "But, promise me." Tears welled in the little girl's eyes, but she nodded. Naomi stood, taking a deep breath before moving toward the front door. Jack was already there, his massive frame blocking the way, his muscles tight beneath his sleek coat. His breathing was steady, controlled, but his eyes, those sharp, intelligent eyes, were burning with an intensity Naomi had never seen before. She reached for the doorknob, but before she could open it, the door burst inward. Naomi barely had time to stumble back as 2 men stormed inside, dragging a struggling figure between them. Zoe. She screamed, but the sound was drowned out by the chaos that followed. Jack moved. He launched himself forward with a force that shook the walls, his body colliding with the first man like a battering ram. The intruder barely had time to react before Jack's powerful jaws clamped down on his forearm. A scream tore from the man's throat as Jack shook his head violently, ripping through muscle and tendon. Blood splattered onto the hardwood floor. The second man cursed, fumbling for the gun at his waistband. But Jack was faster. He released the first man and lunged at the second, his massive paws slamming into his chest, knocking him off balance. The gun clattered to the floor as the man tumbled backward, hitting the coffee table with a sickening crack. Zoe scrambled away, gasping, her eyes locked onto Jack as he tore through their attackers with brutal precision. The first man tried to crawl toward the gun, his bloody arm shaking as he reached for it. Jack snarled, his deep, guttural growl vibrating through the room. He snapped his jaws around the man's wrist and bit down hard, crushing bone. The man's scream was pure agony. Naomi grabbed Zoe, pulling her daughter close as they backed into the kitchen. Her breath came in sharp gasps, her mind spinning. She had never seen anything like this. Jack wasn't fighting like a dog protecting his home. He was fighting like a soldier on a battlefield. He knew exactly where to strike. He targeted hands, wrists, ankles, weak points that would disable his enemies, but keep them alive long enough for them to suffer. The second man tried to push himself up, groaning in pain. Jack didn't let him. He moved swiftly, his powerful legs launching him forward. His teeth sank into the man's thigh, and he pulled hard. The intruder collapsed onto the floor, writhing in pain, his screams mixing with the deep, furious barks that filled the house. The neighbors must have heard. The gunfire from before, the screaming, the snarling, it was too loud, too violent. Jack kept fighting. Even when one of the men managed to land a kick against his side, even when another tried to throw a chair to knock him off, he did not stop. He couldn't. Because his mission wasn't finished. Because Zoe was still in danger. Because Naomi was still in danger. Sirens blared in the distance. Jack heard them, but he didn't stand down. Not yet. Not until the final man, the one who had grabbed Zoe, the one who had dragged her inside, lay broken on the floor, bloodied and gasping for breath. Only then did Jack step back, his powerful chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. The front door swung open. Police officers rushed inside, their guns drawn, their voices loud and commanding. Naomi barely heard them. She was still clutching Zoe, still staring at Jack as he stood tall, his head high, his eyes still burning with fury. One of the officers froze, taking in the scene. The broken men on the floor, the blood smeared across the hardwood, the war dog standing over them like a sentinel. Jesus Christ, one of them muttered. Jack took a step toward Naomi and Zoe, his body still tense, still prepared to fight if necessary. But it was over. The men were being dragged away, their groans of pain barely audible over the sound of radio chatter. The neighbors had gathered outside, whispering, watching in shock. Naomi knelt beside Jack, running her hands over his fur, checking for injuries. There was blood, but most of it wasn't his. His breathing was heavy, but he was still standing, still protecting. Zoe buried her face in his thick coat, sobbing quietly. Naomi looked down at him, her heart swelling with something deeper than gratitude, something that felt almost sacred. Jack wasn't just a dog. He had never been just a dog. He was a soldier, a warrior, and tonight he had saved them all.